Again, welcome. We're so glad that you want to be a part of this. You will not be able to see everybody's face as in some Zoom experiences. It's in the webinar format, so you'll be seeing those of us who are speaking today. But we do invite you, as some are already doing, to introduce yourself and your faith community, if that's applicable, in the chat. If you want to comment as we go along, that is just fine as well. We ask everybody to remember that we come here together to learn and to listen, to learn, to be respectful and kind, whether we agree on everything or not, as we go through the conversation. We are recording today, so this will be available later for you or others to watch. We've done 3 other lecture conversations with Dr. Jones, as well as he was our preacher this morning for the Boston Avenue Church worship experience. And he is with us today, sitting in as well. So welcome, Dr. Jones. We're so glad you could be with us this weekend. I'm going to ask each of the panelists just to briefly introduce themselves and tell us their name and where they work, and so we can kind of see the connection with what our conversation is about today. So Michelle, would you begin?
Sure. Thank you so much for this honor of being asked to participate. My name is Michelle Place, and I'm the Executive Director for the Tulsa Historical Society and Museum. I just passed my 20th anniversary there, so I'm in shock. And my home faith community is the Boston Avenue Church.
All right, Gary.
I'm Gary Palusoverden. I'm President Emeritus at Phillips Theological Seminary here in Tulsa, and am currently directing the Center for Religion and Public Life at the seminary. I'm a United Methodist elder from the Northern Illinois Conference that has been working in Oklahoma for 25 years or so, and I attend and am affiliated with Boston Avenue.
Greg, can we come to you?
Yes, thanks so much for having me. Very excited to be here today. Greg Robinson, my title is Director of Family Engagement at Metcares Foundation. Metcares Foundation was born really out of Metropolitan Baptist Church, and our mission is to ensure that the life outcomes of North Tulsa families steadily improve. And we do that certainly with a deep tie and inspiration back to the Greenwood, Black Wall Street communities.
Great. Thanks so much, Greg. Erica.
Hi, everyone. Good to be with you this afternoon. I am Erica Townsend-Bell. I am Associate Professor of Political Science at Oklahoma State University here in Tulsa and also in Stillwater. I also serve as the Director of the Center for Africana Studies on the OSU campuses, and also live here in Tulsa as a member of St. Augustine Catholic Church.
Fantastic. We're so glad to have everybody. For those of you who are not a part of Boston Avenue, just to let you know what the context is today, at Boston Avenue, we're kicking off a 100-day countdown to the Tulsa Race Massacre 100th anniversary commemoration. We've been doing race relations work here at the church for a long time, particularly our longtime participation in the Martin Luther King Jr. citywide celebrations every year. We began our work on the massacre and learning more about that and being more active in talking about what needs to happen going forward, probably about 5 years ago, praying for God's guidance, educating ourselves, having a variety of conversations and forums about the massacre. We've brought in a number of speakers, had discussions within the congregation, put up displays from the Tulsa Historical Society in our facility, built a relationship with Dr. Robert Turner and historic Vernon A.M.E. Church. He'll be joining us later this afternoon, I believe. But this weekend, we're beginning this 100 days toward racial justice and reconciliation by hosting our Barton-Clinton-Gordey lecturer, Dr. Robert P. Jones, as we feel another important step in our efforts to build better relationships across racial lines, be part of bringing a more effective racial justice and reconciliation practices to any and all who want to be a part of that in Tulsa. Today, we specifically want to have a conversation about the work that is before us in Tulsa to help create a more just church and society here in our city. So we've asked these speakers to come and have that discussion with us. They all bring insight and wisdom from their participation in the Tulsa community from their particular arena of influence. So again, thanks so much for being with us, panelists. Let me start with this question. What role do you think people of faith best play in Tulsa as we're seeking to build better race relations here in the city? Anybody want to take that one right off the bat? Greg, will you jump in?
Well, sure. I pause because there's pastors on the call, so I don't want to get too out of place. But the way that I think about this is really thinking about the history of the role that people of faith and, frankly, faith has played in racial justice, racial healing, racial advancement throughout our history. Frankly, in negative ways and in extremely positive ways. Let's take the civil rights movement, for instance. There were many different approaches to trying to improve the way that Black people were being treated. It was, though, the role and the focus of the Christian faith that said, hey, let's do this in a way, as Martin Luther King would say, going for a beloved community. Let's do this in a way that we're not trying to antagonize each other or to make war with each other, but rather we're leaning in on those Christian values of love and acceptance and seeing each other as we would see ourselves. And it really is a call to something greater, even in the midst of intense injustice. And to me, that's really where the importance of faith lies. There's no doubt that there is injustices happening each and every day. People are being wronged. But if we don't have something to lean on that pushes us to be better, then we're going to fall into chaos. We're going to fall into unrelenting war, essentially. And it is, to me, the faith and an ability to look at something bigger than ourselves and say, you know what, all of us in some ways have to find a way to be better. That, to me, provides a hope that we will one day get to that place. And so for me, I just think about it in terms of it is really the measuring stick, right? To me, still the story of Jesus and the way that he lived is still the measuring stick for how we should treat each other. And I view racial equity right in line with that. So I challenge those who call themselves people of faith to really think about what that means. What does that mean to say, I am a follower of Christ, or I am a person of faith? What does that mean in terms of how you're going to treat your fellow man, even if you don't come from the same places and ideologies as them?
All right. Thanks, Greg. Anybody else want to jump in on what you think the best role people of faith can play in this ongoing work?
I have a few things I would say. One certainly is we need to each know our own histories, which I know I'm singing Dr. Jones's tune on that. I've learned a great deal from his work, and I mean that in the same way he did, as far as the personal histories as well as congregational histories, and then digging even deeper into the congregational. It's not only congregational history. What's kind of state of how people think about race within a particular faith community? And we who are white people really do have to do our own work, which also it is difficult work in that nearly none of us have learned a history in our education that is a sufficient history for where we're at this point in the country right now. And that's not just it's only been in the last 20 years that the Tulsa Race Massacre has been more widely taught and known and the like. That it's the negative consequences of manifest destiny and the American exceptionalism and the history of chosenness and the like that has benefited, used to benefit white society. And I'm a huge advocate for teaching American history in church in a way that that says, here's a bigger story here. And it's not quite as rosy as maybe some of us have been taught. That's one way.
Great. Thanks, Gary. Reverend Dr. Turner has joined us. Robert, if you would say a word about where you work, and then if you want to respond to what these folks are saying in terms of the role people of faith play in the ongoing work to build better relationships across racial lines and work on justice and reconciliation, we'd love for you to comment.
Hey, David, good to see you, good friend in Boston Avenue, and everybody who's on this panel. Always a pleasure to be in your midst, especially Michelle and Greg and so many others of you. Really appreciate all that you do. I'm sitting in my office at historic Vernon A.M.E Church, 307-311 North Greenwood Avenue. We started in 1905, and we came here to this location in 1908. And we are the oldest continuous landowner of the same parcel of land in the whole Greenwood district. We've owned our parcel of land since 1908, the same parcel of land. And our church fathers and mothers were leaders here in the Greenwood district. We built our edifice, our basement in 1914, finished in 1919. Then in 1921, began building our superstructure. During the Race Massacre in 1921, that was destroyed and greatly damaging our basement, but miraculously it survived. And it is today the only thing still left on Greenwood Avenue from Black Wall Street era that we still have. And that is nothing but a testament to God. We rebuilt after the massacre with no help from our insurance company, no help from the city, members of this church, leaders in the community, and we put their names on stained glass windows. So folks like Simon Baird, who owned one of the few blacks who owned the airplane, was contributed and made this possible. R.T. Bridgewater, one of the first black physicians, J.T. Owens, and several other people, Barney Cleaver, several other icons in the Greenwood community were members of our church. And we are still trying to hold up the bloodstained banner in the same location. So we saw urban renewal, we saw urban removal, which is what it became to our membership. And we were offered a check to leave, but we stayed. We saw the building of the interstate highway, and we still stayed. And I mean, we saw the rise of gentrification, and we still are here today. And it's kind of like some people now laugh when people say, this is not a place for a church to be, but this is where the church was. This is like, we were here before everything else was. And how I feel people of faith have communicated or tried to help with bringing about equity and equality. It's something I did my dissertation on, and I called it, prophetic civic engagement throughout entire history of Christianity, but not just Christianity, but all faiths. You've had individuals who used pillars of their teachings, pillars of their faith, to try to improve the public good, so to speak. That's not always the case for everybody, but you have had a subset in every denomination and every religion that sought to do that. And I think that those remnants are what each generation should try to aspire to. Every generation has a remnant of people. You have them in Boston Avenue. I see them every week when they come out to help with our food ministry. And I see other pockets throughout Tulsa, people of faith that are getting involved, trying to make this world, trying to make this country a more perfect union. And it's not always something that people tweet about or do on social media, but I see it, and I thank God for those of you who continue to do that.
Thanks, Robert. Erica looks at, in her work, political science and social movements for justice and social change. Erica, can you comment on the role people of faith have taken in different kinds of social movements and what role they've played in those?
Sure. I come to this question as a social scientist, but also as a Catholic. And so speaking to the latter to some degree, I think what we see reflecting the comments that we've heard thus far is this sort of a two-part approach, right? So especially in the liberation theology tradition of Catholicism, right? And in the serious call to be pro-life in all of its manifestations, to center the poor, right? To act as Jesus did, or to try our best anyway. I think we have a really, really powerful model, and we have seen that be so productive in the United States and outside. Of course, with the Catholic tradition, one of the wonderful things it does is the way in which it links people across boundaries. And then simultaneously, I think also speaking to the Catholic tradition, religion generally is caught up in modern race and racism. And Catholicism is at the center of that, right? When we think about the first colonies, it was the Spanish and the Portuguese coming to the New World and imposing the modern hierarchy that would lead to our understanding of race as something meaningfully different, right? Not just the difference among humans. There are many differences among humans, but the notion that some kinds of differences matter and that we rank on the basis of that, right? There's some pretty deep roots in the spread of Catholicism and its very deep engagement with colonialism and capitalism. And so I think to the big question, what do people of faith need to do? Part of it is to, as we have heard espoused, is to understand, is to center a concern with racial justice. I mean, it's probably the most basic answer. It's not going to just happen, right? That same work has to be centered within the religious community and in the way that it has to be centered in all communities. But I think to do that most productively, it's not the case that everybody has to be engaged in this work, but there has to be a really deep reckoning with history. I think at the level of the congregation, at the level of the faith tradition, and maybe even more broadly, just an understanding the ways in which Christianity has been caught up with this significant inequity throughout the centuries.
Right. Dr. Jones has really helped us with those lectures, giving us some more insight into that history. Michelle, were you trying to get in?
Sure. As one of my good friends helped me to realize, because I'm a historian, I tend to look backwards. And so sometimes I think I need to look forwards. And one of the things that calls to mind is, if I am a follower of Christ, and fortunately being a member of the Methodist Church, which speaks to me, that thing that we go to so often, REST, our reason, our experience, our scriptures, and our tradition. And how did those speak to how do we need to be the kingdom of God? The other thing that really speaks to me is, just as we attend church, however often we're able to do that in whatever way, Sunday mornings or however we participate, or our Sunday school classes, it's that idea of continually learning, and that we're not going to get this racism business, check off our list, move on. We're in it for the long haul as followers of Christ.
Right. Excellent. Well, thank you. So Dr. Jones has talked this weekend about racial justice and reconciliation, but he also adds in the word repair as a step we need to take. Does repair spark anything in your imagination when you hear that in the context of Tulsa and our history here? I'll just give that to any of you on the panel who might respond.
Well, I think everybody knows how I feel on that topic. I think you can see the sign behind me. It is so necessary for any sort of reconciliation. And I think, and I was also last week able to watch the hearing, the congressional HR 40 hearing in the subcommittee. And I heard an individual who I will remain nameless because I want to keep the integrity of this about, being positive. But I heard another Christian, say that to the effect of reparations is not something children of God should seek, right? And I commented during the live viewing of that to say, I don't, and that's why I don't understand sometimes what people are being taught in Sunday school or Bible study or even doing Sunday morning, because reparations is synonymous with the word atonement. And atonement is what we believe Christ did for us. He repaired the breach. He was the bridge literally over troubled waters to connect, to reconcile humanity back to the Father. And so what if Jesus had said, you know what, Dad, I didn't commit that sin. I'm not going to die for Robert. I didn't commit that sin David did. Greg did that. I didn't do that. Why should I have to die for that? But he didn't. He went and paid. He repaired something that he didn't even do. So I think it's very disingenuous at best to hear other Christians. I could understand some other faiths not supporting it in principle, but Christians, like, our founding principle is atonement. Like, we would not be saved were it not for Jesus being our reparations. And so I think that the Christian church especially should be in the forefront of this movement. And I'm working on some things to that effect right now, because it is past time for the church to be silent on this. I appreciate, I just read recently, our Jewish brothers and sisters are in support of reparations, because it's also a Hebrew text principle as well. It's an Old Testament principle. Every religion pretty much talks about the need for repair if you have harmed anybody or oppressed anybody. So yeah, I think that it is not something that is supplemental to our faith. I think it's foundational to our faith, and I think that we ought to be one of the biggest proponents of it.
All right. Anybody else want to respond to the repair idea?
I do. Not only is it foundational to the Jewish faith, but they received reparations already, as have so many different peoples that have been wronged. African Americans just haven't. And I will actually take it out of the faith context for a second and just speak very plainly. Every day I drive by the streets of downtown Tulsa, and I see cranes, and I see banks, and I see ballparks, and all I can think about is bones. Bones that are very likely lying underneath those very buildings, and bones of people who never received any sort of justice. And right now, people from all across this city and all across this country are watching Tulsa, and we aren't having a conversation internally about what needs to be done to provide justice. We aren't having a conversation about what needs to be done to truly reckon with what occurred. We're having a more comforting conversation about how we can just move past it and reconcile. We're actually having a conversation, frankly, that is going to lead to perpetuating further the massacre. When you build, whether it's a building or a museum, when you talk about the tourism dollars that are going to come into a city, and yet you do not have a system, you do not have a manner in which the money that is going to be generated off of the story of destruction to go back to the people whose lives and whose economic system was destroyed, you are perpetuating the same massacre that you were a part of. And I'm speaking directly to institutions like the city of Tulsa. The massacre did not occur in 3 hours, and then there were people there putting the fire out. It occurred over multiple days. That means that it was by design. That means that it was in collaboration with. And so there is a debt to pay. There is justice that must be done. And the reality is that we too often think that we can get in our silos and just comfort ourselves past these issues. Black people in the city of Tulsa are not over it. And we're watching to see what is going to be done 100 years later when we do have the opportunity to do something about it. Because as Dr. Turner said, none of us so-called participated in it. I would argue, though, that some of us have benefited very greatly from what was done. And so this is the piece that we have to work hardest at. If we're ever truly going to move forward, if we're ever truly going to move towards reconciliation, we do have to first deal with repair. And repair starts with telling the truth and then providing justice for that truth. And justice must come in the form of economics, because ultimately what was truly taken away from Black people in the 1920s was generations of generational wealth that they accumulated and should be benefiting from through their hard-earned mental capacity and their hard-earned and their hands. That was taken away. It's never been given back. And frankly, the white power structure is still today profiting. And I'm afraid if something doesn't change dramatically, we're going to look up and be commemorating a perpetuation of a massacre, not justice for it.
Let's talk about, if we were going to try to measure justice, or if we were going to say, we will know we know we've achieved justice because we have done these 3 things or 10 things. I would love to hear from the panel, just 1 or 2 ideas from each of you about, in a real tangible or measurable way, what do you think in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 100 years later after the massacre, what would constitute racial justice? What would those markers be? Gregory's just given us some. Gary, jump in.
Yeah, well, several things. One is I would certainly say the life expectancy disparity between zip codes would have closed as a big one. Reparations pointing to economic development, I think, would be a huge one. Not even so much like, just transfer of wealth, but we're really talking about economic development, because people people need jobs, people need good places to live, people need good schools throughout the city. I want to just go back a little bit, because I want to say why I think Dr. Jones's point about repair is so much more helpful at this point in time, I think, than even the Christian concept of reconciliation. Amongst a lot of white Christians, reconciliation is work that's already been done. It's been done by God and Jesus, and it is appropriated on an individual basis. And it is just by a matter of grace and forgiveness that happens. And the justice component is often left out of that equation. And I think that the way that repair is going to work in a public sphere doesn't translate 100% what reconciliation may mean within a lot of white theological contexts. I totally agree with where Dr. Turner was in terms of the importance of reconciliation in the Christian faith, and that it is a transferable concept. But I really fear that the way in which that's heard by white evangelicals is individualistic rather than systemic, and it's work that's already been done. It's all about forgiveness, and justice doesn't measure in, and that's not helpful to the work that needs to be done.
Very good. Thank you, Gary. Erica or Michelle, you want to comment on the justice definition or measurement for justice?
This is a place that I have great difficulty in putting my finger on and being able to articulate it. And I think because could it be that it's not up to me to give that answer? That when I'm in the white majority, and that nothing is worse than the white majority continuing to come in and say, here's what you need to fix the problem. And so I just think there needs to be a lot more listening to do. And that's all the answer that I have on repair, because I don't
Well.
have the answer to it. Yeah.
Well, it good though. That's a good word for all of us to hear, particularly if we're in the white majority, that listening is so important to this. Erica was commenting about whose voices we center or whose concerns we center earlier in terms of those who are poor or those who've been disenfranchised. So Erica, you want to follow up and say any more in terms of what justice looks like in terms of social dynamics or civic engagement?
Sure. I smiled when you asked that question because, I mean, the fundamental answer to these kinds of questions is racial justice will be achieved when we don't need to talk about racial justice anymore, right? So, I mean, it's a fairly easy answer, not at all an easy process to get to, right? And I think in terms of sort of specific touch points, you know, I think we have no shortage of conversation about this and a variety of different indicators that we might look to and that we should be looking to around, you know, sort of material evidence of racial disparity that we want to see go away. But fundamentally, I think we'll know we've achieved racial justice precisely when we can enter into any space in the public sphere and we can be entering into it, engaging in it from a space of community, right? Which I think to Gary's point is a real and growing concern in the United States, right? The way in which the sort of traditional individualist notion or individualist approach to the public sphere in the United States has been, in my opinion, frankly, weaponized in the service of racism and a variety of injustices, right? Because it makes it very, very easy to walk away from all of these kinds of questions. If you disavow the role of the church, if you disavow the role of community in fixing problems that are clearly structural and cannot be addressed sufficiently from an individual approach, or from just, you know, we can't just food bank our way and charity our way out of the significant number of problems that we have in the United States and globally, right? So really fundamentally, when we have a space in which everyone's voices are centered and where we can focus equally, we can have equal focus on whatever the central problem is, food insecurity, transportation, whatever the issue is, and try to solve that together, I think is when we will have achieved racial justice.
Excellent.
David, can I jump in?
Yes,
one,
sir. Jump right in, Robert.
Yeah, one small point I want to make here is I think for many white people, there is this kind of willful obfuscation that happens on this question, right? Where we pretend as if, you know, when the congressional hearings were held on this, and I'll stick with the example of Reverend Dr. Turner's here of not naming a name here, but we had one of our, you know, top national leaders say, we wouldn't know how to calculate the compensations. We wouldn't know who to compensate, you know, as if that was a rational response. But just in the very thing went by very fast. And Reverend Dr. Turner's comments, he said the insurance company didn't help, the city didn't help when they went to rebuild the church. Now, if that had been a white church, that would not have been true, right? And that went for the Black businesses that were torched to the ground. Who were looking for funds to rebuild. And I think those kinds of very concrete disparities. So Reverend Dr. Turner, if you took those funds that the physicians and the people in your church took out of their pockets to put into the church, and you invested those funds over 100 years, I mean, they would be worth a significant amount of money today, right? Those are funds that came out of people's pockets to rebuild an institution that should have been covered by insurance and city coverages in an equitable fashion. So like just something as small as that, and you multiply that by 100 for the other, you know, at least 100 for the other businesses there, multiply that across cities across the country. Because one of the, I think, astonishing things is that while the Tulsa Race Massacre was one of the worst atrocities of this kind, it was not the only one. There were more than a dozen of these kinds of events where dozens and hundreds of African Americans were killed by really white mass racial violence over periods of days in, you know, more than a dozen states across the country. I mean, this was not one isolated event. So just if you take that, you set aside slavery, you set aside disenfranchisement, of voting and Jim Crow, even if you just took these little isolated events, you come up with, a serious amount of money that is owed, right? So it's not a matter of charity. And as Dr. Townsend-Bell said, I mean, we're not going to charity our way out of this. And that's not even what's called for here. I mean, what we're really talking about is restitution, right? And justice of things that were stolen. Right? That's what we're talking about, right? We're not talking about out of the goodness of our hearts and that kind of a thing. We're really talking about restoring things that were unjustly taken from others. Like that's what we're really talking about here. So I think if we sort of just think of it that way, it all of a sudden becomes much less abstract and mysterious and very concrete, right? With very examples that all of us in our families, those of us who are white, if you do very little research at all on, where did you get a loan? Where did your parents get a loan for their house? Who backed that loan? Where could they, in what neighborhood could they buy a house, right? All of those things, if you're white, you have advantages that you probably didn't pay any attention to because they were just there. But they certainly weren't there for our African-American brothers and sisters and other people of color.
Great, Robert. Good insights. Anybody want to respond to that?
Yes, I want to just add a piece to that. He's absolutely correct. Two things. One, I do hear what Gary mentioned about, a lot of evangelicals will say, well, Jesus paid it all, so why I have to pay anything else, right? That's funny. They never say that when it comes to the church offering, though. I never hear them say, well, Christ paid it all, so why am I still paying my tithes? It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work. There's still, as Paul says, a need for us to work out our soul salvation, right? There's still a need for, as Jesus told Peter after he betrayed him or denied him 3 times, if you love me, Peter, feed my sheep. And there's several examples in the Bible about how people wanting things from God. The individual who was indebted to the king, and the king did not take out punishment on him, but he goes back and he demands somebody who owed him several less pennies than what he owed the king. He demanded that person pay him at once, but wanted grace from God. So the Bible is replete of us wanting things from God, but not willing to show it to humankind. And so how can man expect to receive repair or atonement from God, but we not be willing to show that same amount of repair? Not even the same amount, a little bit less, because what Jesus did is far much more valuable than what the government, if we ever get reparations, is asking this country to do. And secondly, this notion that I also heard during the commentary of the HR bill subcommittee, one of the individuals was speaking to the fact that Black people just need this. They have this victim mentality, and they act like they just need reparations to make it. And to me, that boiled my skin, because I am a descendant of slaves, right, who were kidnapped over 400 years ago and brought over here to this country. And to say that we need that to survive takes away the resilience and perseverance of people who survived the worst mass transportation of any human beings in the history of the world, called the Middle Passage. Survive being enslaved, American slavery, which was different from every other form of slavery in the world. That survived Jim Crow, that was so bad Adolf Hitler was about to use it for Germany, but said that was too bad for them to even use in Germany against the Jews. That survived redlining, that survived, to this day, mass incarceration. Black people, descendants of slaves, and all Black people across the diaspora, we don't need reparations as a victim. We deserve it as citizens. That is the difference. This is about whether or not we are seen as equal citizens in this country. Our history has shown we can make it anyhow, and God has blessed us to make it anyhow. But if the Constitution is right, then reparations is ours. If Lady Justice is blind, then reparations is ours, whether or not we financially need it or not. It's about whether or not we deserve it as citizens. Can this happen to any other group of people in this nation and they not be repaired from it? If that answer is no, it cannot, then reparations should definitely be out. And history has shown us that no other group of people have had to endure what Black folks have and not received a penny for it. We did it for the Japanese Americans. We did it for the Hawaiian Americans. We do it every year, and I support those things for the Jewish Holocaust survivors. I support what we did for Japanese Americans, but we cannot do it for Black people. That's preposterous, in spite of the fact that we paid slave owners during the Civil War. We paid the Confederacy during the Civil War, but you can't pay the slaves that actually gave them their cup of water, that worked in the plantation fields of Georgia and Alabama. That is preposterous. And I think one of your questions was, what does it look like? I'm all for having that conversation. Tulsa, you have a head start. Tulsa, we have the Tulsa Race, they call it Race Riot Commission Report 2001, February 28th, 2001. Go check it out. It's on PDF right now. They had 5 recommendations. The first one was direct payments to the survivors. Second one was direct payments to the descendants in the absence of the survivors. The third one was economic incubator. The fourth one was memorial. And the fifth one was scholarships. None of those have been done. They had some scholarships, but they weren't just limited to Black children or the survivors. And if you want to call the John Hope Franklin Center the memorial, or you want to call Green Rising the memorial, that's still, even they would tell you that is not just for the 1921 Race Massacre. It talks about history of everything. So nothing has been done. I would like to add a 6th one, which is criminal charges. To this day, not one of those people who dropped bombs, who looted, who killed, kidnapped, forced Black folks to be involuntarily enslaved during the aftermath of the Race Massacre, not one of them were ever charged with the crime. And to me, how can we say we live in the land of law and order? And not one, the very first time airplanes used to terrorize Americans was not 9/11, was not even Pearl Harbor, but was right here in Tulsa. And none of those pilots, none of those white deputized members of the mob saw a day in jail. That to me is wrong. We haven't even had an investigation. Our district attorney, our attorney general has never even investigated the worst crime in this city's history. And if we say we're serious about justice, then how can we not do that?
I would just say it's not just what we do, but how we do it. Let's look at the boundaries of Greenwood as they currently exist, right? Why not re-recognize the original boundaries of the Greenwood district? And then when you do that, which I'm not sure if people understand, but that encompasses not just the current couple blocks of Greenwood, but all the way to the west, covering the majority of what we know as the Arts District, formerly the Brady District as well. And then infuse the same tax incentives that we do to build up the downtown area as we have, and allocate a portion of every sales tax to a Black-owned financial institution. That way, you're creating a sustainable way to say, you know what? Not only should things be paid for what was done in the past, but the reality is we have to make up for what doesn't exist now and won't exist into the future. The other thing about that is it doesn't punish the business owner that's in the area now. It simply acknowledges that a portion of every hot dog that's bought at a baseball park, or every soda that's bought at a local restaurant within that area, there's a portion of that should go back to the very communities that land in which that business sits on was stolen. Another example of this, when we talk about housing, and we know through the data that housing is the #1 way that wealth was created in this country. And we know that systemically, as Reverend Jones said, that systemically, Black folks were not able to buy houses, were not able to get the same loans and so on. Why not create policies that say, we are going to look at the ways in which Black people have survived. For instance, paying their rent for years and years and years on time, and yet cannot get the loan to own that home. Why not create policies that say, if you're a renter and you've paid on time for this amount of time, your credit is good. And we're going to supplement what you don't have, because we know historically that there's probably a systemic reason for that. I'm speaking these because a lot of times I think when we hear reparations, we think solely about a direct payment. And while certainly direct payments are due, direct payments in themselves are not going to solve the wealth gap. They're not going to create generational wealth, because let me ask you something. When the majority of people got direct payments this year from our government, what did the people who didn't have any money do with that direct payment? They had to give it right back. Newsflash, the same thing will happen, because there has been a destruction of the systems in which Black people have been able to build wealth. And so when I think about tangible ways, I'm thinking about sustainable ways. Investing the millions of dollars that are owned, billions of dollars, frankly, that are owned into Black-owned financial institutions so that they can make low or no interest loans, creating tax incentives out of areas that have historically been robbed from Black people so that there's sustainable money that's being contributed. To me, those are practical ways that actually solve for the issues that are creating the disparities right now that we're living with.
Love your idea of sustainable policies and practices, so that it's not a one-time kind of decision or a one kind of payment and we think we're done. It seems like so often we try to just do one thing and think, okay, it's great. We've done that one step. We've absolved, we've fixed the system, we're forgiven, we're reconciled. And your idea of having structures and policies put in place that sustain economic development, in your example, are terrific, I think. The city is doing a set of equality indicators over these last 2 or 3 years. I'm thinking several of you have mentioned healthcare and housing and economics. Any of you have a view about if those equality indicators are giving us good evidence to move forward? Is that a helpful piece of the process so far?
I'll speak to this and I'll be quiet on it. Actually, the equality indicators has been used as a tool really to educate the community on data that I say they were feeling, but they didn't necessarily ever see, right? And so because of the way it's done, and frankly, a very simple format, it allows for community organizations, churches, governmental agencies alike to take that data and not just formulate solutions to them, but actually have conversations with the people who are being impacted by that and educate them on that data. I think as much as the data probably gets us frustrated with where we are not, I think it's an example of how transparency in utilizing data actually can be a powerful tool in moving us forward, because as many folks have talked about, it takes it out of the abstract, right? When you understand that the median income between a Black family and a white family right now, white people are earning double in the city of Tulsa than Black folks are in terms of families. When you look at criminal justice and you see whether you're talking about youth or adults, the arrest rates and the use of force rates are 3 and 4 times that between races. We spoke about earlier the life expectancy gap, which is about as plain as you can make it. I think the equality indicators are an example of what happens when you make numbers plain. And now it allows for Tulsans really all to come together and answer the question of what are we going to do about this? I really do credit a lot of the movement that we've seen, if it's only in conversation and if it's only in fighting right now, it's still movement. And I credit the equality indicators for really shining a light. I think we've got to get more transparency in terms of data because I think it's just extremely helpful to advance in this conversation.
Yeah, I agree. And I would echo both of the last two comments that Greg said. And I'm struck by, to the previous point about, what we know and the ways in which we might, if we chose to, restructure, for instance, how is it that one is credited as having good credit, right? That you paid your own time and these sorts of things. And I was struck as we're talking through that we had a Consumer Protection Bureau that was introduced that tried to do and has been trying to do precisely some of this work and has been fought consistently along the way. And so I think the transparency piece is so critical here precisely because it does open the conversation. We have a much better sense of where we are and what's on the table. And frustrating as it might be, what that allows is both for some discussion about how do we move forward meaningfully, as well as it requires at a minimum those who would uphold racial injustice to be quite clear about what position they take on these indicators, right? We're all clear on what the problem is. We are all clear that there's clear evidence of racial injustice. We're not all clear, I think, that there's a desire to move forward in fixing that. But what we have minimally is that there has to be you have to put your money where your mouth is, right? You have to speak to your unwillingness to try to move ahead of this problem. And I think that's where we'll have to see sort of where this goes. One of the things that I have been struck by, and I think we've been seeing this happening since really the end of segregation, but it seems to be reaching a peak, is in the United States in particular, the desire to uphold white supremacy, to be quite frank, is making life very, very difficult for Black people, for people of color, and increasingly for white people themselves, right? There are some significant costs being paid to uphold this access to wealth for a smaller and smaller pool of the population. And it's almost like a self-implosion. I mean, it's really troubling and unfortunate to watch. And so I think part of what equality indicators and really transparent data helps us to do is to see that process more clearly and to decide what, if anything, we're going to do about it.
Erica, there's a question in the chat about that you might be able to answer since you're talking about this. Where do you put past attempts for racial equality, such as the Great Society, in the context or in relationship to reparations?
I think it's not accidental that we see these attempts at the Great Society, and this is precisely, actually was just reading an article about this earlier today. We see sort of simultaneously the South make some significant changes in the way in which it votes, right? And the candidates that it puts forward, some significant changes in its understanding of the relationship of Christianity to politics. And these things, I think, are not accidental. When the population that we were speaking of and when that we were trying to address was one that was, I think, in the common understanding, predominantly white, and where there was no need to extend those benefits to a broader population, there was great support, right? And then we got to the post-segregation moment, and the understanding of population has to overlap the actual population of the United States, and we see support by white Americans for any of these kinds of programs tank. And of course, if we look back historically, what we know actually happened in the Great Society moment, and also when we come into Social Security, is that there were some significant fights in Social Security, for instance, just to take one example, was a hard fought win and was significantly delayed in the United States, in part because there was a lot of maneuvering that had to happen to make sure that it was only really available for white Americans. Because it's the basic idea of Social Security is not one that lends itself to racial segregation, if you will, right? You have to create that. And so there's a long history of just precisely how that was done so that it was not available to, for instance, Black soldiers coming home from the war, who surely should have qualified among many other groups, right? So I think that we have these lots of moments historically where we understand some policies have only spoken to one particular racial group, and where if we're not looking at it historically and in sort of the full array of the events that happen, we don't appreciate the way in which this is never accidental.
Great. I really appreciate your perspective and history on some of that. Some context for that, I think, helps a lot of us. I want to shift a little bit to places where we might have seen churches. I mean, we're not the only church, obviously, in the city, or the only group talking about how can we build better race relations. Many of us obviously are aware that we're counting down toward the 100th anniversary. We know people are working for racial justice or reconciliation on the eve of all this. What examples would any of you all be able to lift up in terms of efforts that are proving effective or giving hope? We talked a little bit about the equality indicators as a recent phenomenon in the city. Are there other efforts that you see from churches, from civic groups, from legislators, from whatever perspective that you think are hopeful signs that we're moving forward?
I would like to say, and not just because you are doing this discussion today, but I think the shining example of Boston Avenue is a bright spot in the city of Tulsa. The work that you're doing in the community, having these courageous conversations, even before it was kind of cool to talk about difficult topics. You know, you guys have been doing this for several years now, and that's to be commended. The work you're doing in the community. I know personally what you guys do every week here at Vernon. I think is a shining bright spot, and the work even going forward. And there are other places. All Souls is doing a remarkable job. Marlon Lavenhar, fighting for justice, and trying to help people uncover the truth. United Congregational Church of Christ, Chris Moore, definitely doing some wonderful work. And of course, North Tulsa churches like my good friend, Dr. Ray Owens, is doing a phenomenal job with Metropolitan and Met Cares and all the things that they do. I know Greg will be too modest to brag about his church, but the organization, but Met Cares does a wonderful job in our community. And just, I mean, we have several places throughout, but not nearly enough. It would be beautiful. For one of my hopes is anyway, for the body of Christ to be what she was not in 1921, to be what it should be in 2021. You know, it's a shame. I got a picture, thanks to the Tulsa Historical Society, of our church basement just a few months after the massacre. And the only people on top of our basement roof helping to restore it are the Black members of our church. That's it. I wish, and we had several white churches during that time, but the only people that came to lend a helping hand were the members of Vernon. But my prayer to God and God's words to me, you know, by doing ministry and doing work, open the doors to all of God's people and allow them to be the church in 2021 they were not in 1921. And it's been really impressive to see. So not nearly enough, but there are some bright spots here in Tulsa.
I would add to that. I've been really inspired by groups like the University of Tulsa, their law center, who just opened up a legal clinic. And I think it was the way they went about doing it. I know they had interviews with probably 50 to 100 different people to figure out the best way to do that, to really make an impact within this space. I think that's an incredible example. I think my conversations with Dr. Fry at Oklahoma State University, Tulsa, understanding where that university sits and their history of really negative decision making. I think she's someone who has shown an ability to listen and is actually putting actions to the things that she's hearing. I think from an institutional level, those are two great examples. I also don't want us to forget about the groups who were doing this before it was sexy, as I could like to say it. African Ancestral Society and is a church and which is also supported sort of in that connecting network with the Unitarian Universalist network there with Reverend oh my goodness.
Gerald Davis.
Reverend Gerald Davis, and the work of the Chief Amasons and the Christy Williamses of the world, who really kept the story of Greenwood going when it wasn't popular, when no one wanted to speak about it. I don't think we can leave them out now that everyone's talking about it. I would say to that point, the Black women in this city that I truly, truly admire. When you think about Representative Regina Goodwin, when you think about Councilwoman Vanessa Hall Harper, when you think about Dr. Tiffany Crutcher, you think about Eunice Tarver at Tulsa Community College. We're on with Dr. Erica. Black women everywhere, but it's particularly for me in Tulsa, have carried this torch forward in leadership, and their courageousness, their authenticity, and in spite of the obstacles that we know they all face, to me, is one of the reasons that I actually do have hope we're going to get to where we say we want to get to. So I think there's a ton of things going right. I think we need to acknowledge the people who were doing it behind closed doors before anybody was actually watching.
I just want to underline too, I know, I don't know what the pandemic has done to the fellowship that Antioch Baptist and Southern Hills Baptist had been about, but these are, two significant Baptist congregations who actually, it was a couple of their members who were working side by side, who discovered they were both Baptists and brought the idea to their pastors. We really ought to be talking to each other across town. And they started a whole lot of fellowship work together. They marched in the Martin Luther King Jr. parade once or twice before the pandemic. I don't know where the state of that is now, but there's an example of two congregations just took the initiative and did it. There's no program, there's no obstacle to that happening. These are two voluntary organizations who used their voluntary time and said, this is important work, and they got into doing it.
Yeah, great example. Thanks, Gary, for sharing that. Anybody else want to share examples of work that's being done now that you think is proving effective in Tulsa, or maybe it's happening someplace else, but could be replicated in Tulsa?
I would add that the movements within many businesses and civic organizations to focus on diversity and inclusion. I look at Williams, at AEP PSO, at One Oak and One Gas, the Bank of Oklahoma, and certainly others. When you start calling names, there's a problem with that. But civic organizations, I'm a member of the Rotary Club of Tulsa, and I know that is a huge initiative on our part, is diversity and inclusion, whether it's the speakers that you bring in, the programs that you have, and committing funds.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is interesting way to think about it. We've talked about what the city or a state might do in terms of funding something, but obviously some of our larger local businesses have begun to commit funds and time and resources in terms of their workforce, not just education, but hiring practices and those kind of things. So those are important to remember as well.
Yeah,
Any other examples?
I would echo those. I think rather than examples, what I would just say is that, I think we know at this point how social change happens, right? It's harder. That doesn't mean that it's easy to make happen, but how does it happen? We have really important forebears, at least historically. I think this is sort of changing in the last decade as there's a real shift to kind of the leaderless movements. But historically, right, there's been these sort of standard bearers around whom, people coalesce, but there's been lots of people doing the work in a lot of different places. And I think we are seeing a sort of a real uptick in that, or at least one that's notable in Tulsa. And I think that is really heartening. And so we see it in the education system. I know Tulsa Public Schools, my kids in TPS, so I've been able to watch kind of as a parent at OSU, at TU, in businesses and communities. One of the things that I've been seeing a little bit more lately that I find really promising is not just an uptick in this work, but an uptick in us talking to one another, right? And trying to engage with one another, dual programs. What are you working on? It's just so that we're not, because so much of the problem is that there's often been a lot of people doing work, but it's in these sort of silos, right? So we can't get that kind of energy that we need to move things forward. So I think that that's both promising in terms of where we are so far, and something that I hope will continue to grow. Right, is that we really are thoughtful about how can we engage both in the spaces that we have the most connection to, but also across those spaces to continue to move this work forward.
Excellent. Thank you, Erica. All right, let me shift a little bit. That's kind of institutional. Before we close, we've got lots of people listening today. We have had hundreds of people listen to the lectures that Dr. Jones has given earlier this week and over the weekend. And this question kind of comes out of the chat and the Q&A from the participants. They want us to talk a little bit about the difference between a person, this would be a white person typically in America, saying, I'm not racist, so my work is done. I don't really have any part of that, over against deciding to be someone who is anti-racist. So I don't know who wants to start with that, but if several of you would comment on the differences you see in those two attitudes, that'd be great. Michelle, I know you've had some of your own personal experience with some of that over these last few years of going to international conferences and talking about racism around the world. Maybe you should start us out on this one.
Oh, okay. I have had the opportunity. It was, I would say, the invitation to go and talk internationally about Tulsa, Oklahoma, and about this massacre that we had happened in 1921. When this task force was put together, I think the overriding feeling amongst us was, what do we have to say to the rest of the world? And it was a big shock for us when this conference that we went to called Just Governance in Switzerland, and there were 300 people from around the world who sat spellbound as we told our story, and as we told how, like, I come from the historical point of view and from a museum. And then we had Alicia Latimer from the library system. And then we had other people in business in different areas, descendants, et cetera. And so I think the takeaway from that was, this was much bigger. It's huge, and the world's watching, and they are looking at America as the gold standard for race relations. And if we don't get it right, there isn't a prayer for the rest of the world. And to have someone from Rwanda say that to you is then a huge responsibility that each and every one of us need to shoulder.
Thank you. Gary?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to be quick. So I'm almost through Ibram Kendi's Stamp from the Beginning. So I'm going to say it this way. If you're white in America, you're racist in some way. And the only question is, what are you doing with your racism? Right? Because our basic narratives, our sense of who belongs and who doesn't and under what conditions, and our moral order have all been determined to help white people be in control of the country. And in many ways be in control of the airwaves and a whole lot of other things. So in that way, rather than saying, well, I'm racist, I'm not racist, I think it's even better to start with, now, if you're white, you have benefited from racism in this country and you are racist in some way. What are you doing with that knowledge? Are you perpetuating it, or are you trying in the anti-racist way to help rectify the country so that equality, and this is so many historians are starting to say the same thing, so that equality becomes as important as freedom and liberty have been here. Freedom and liberty for white people, make freedom and liberty, if you put equality in there, then you get something that looks like justice. But all by itself, freedom and liberty is been for white people.
Can I just follow on to that real quickly? I mean,
Sure.
the one thing I would say, and thanks for that, there's two statements that as I kind of do events around the country, that I hear that always indicate to me that a lot of work still needs to be done. One of them is, I'm not racist, but, and the other one is, in the church context, we need to keep politics out of the church.
Mhm.
Both of those statements, I think, are usually in the service of advancing white supremacy. And I think being very clear about that when we feel the urge, we white people, we white Christians feel the urge or feel that bubbling up from the depths of our being, we should take that as a kind of convicting movement of the Spirit, right? That's telling us, oh no, like there's more work to be done here.
Thank you, Robert Jones. Robert Turner wanted to get in.
Yeah, I was just going to add two things. One, I failed to mention, I'm happy that Sharon mentioned it. None of this work that we're doing, that I'm doing, I quoted all the time, the commission of 2001, their report, could be possible without the late, great Senator Maxine Horner. She just went home to be with the Lord a few days ago. And she and Representative Don Ross laid the groundwork for everything else that we've been trying to build on. And they actually took it to the state legislature. So I definitely have to give credit to the mother of the Tulsa reparations movement. To me, she's been a jewel. Her and Eddie Faye Gates and several others, but Maxine Horner is absolutely remarkable. But that statement about not being racist or anti-racist, I think that to not be racist is just to be human. Like that, I mean, you don't get extra points for not being a racist. Like, I mean, are you on the cookie for not being a racist? Oh, that's great. You're not a racist. That to me, that should be in 2021. That should be a given that people are not racist or should try to be not racist. You right? The goal really is to be anti-racist and to fight against racism, because if you, as a patriot, right, if you love this country, why wouldn't you want to address this country's original sin, which is racism? And I've said it before, and I've been quoted on it. If you have an organization and it does not exist to eliminate racial inequity, then why are you in existence? Even as a church, like one of the biggest sins in our culture and society in America is the sin of racism. So if you are in the church and you don't preach against it, it's not enough for you to not preach about it. Because sometimes people get that as an excuse. I don't preach hate, so I shouldn't be held responsible. But guess what? The folks who committed insurrection on our nation's capital, January 6th, I'm not a betting man, but in Oklahoma, everybody is, because you got so many casinos. But if I were, I would wager my dollar or your dollar to my dime that those folk went to somebody's church that Sunday. What sermon did they hear? What message did they hear to make them feel it's okay to go and commit armed insurrection in our nation's capital? So we don't have the luxury of saying, well, I just won't talk about race. I won't be political, because the silence of the church, this unholy silence of the church for far too long has caused many people to lose their lives.
I'll just tell a story about my wife, who's a white woman, a teacher at a local school, and she was granted a promotion, and she too was reading Stamped from the Beginning, and I observed her have this moment of dissonance and realizing that perhaps the process that she didn't actually have to go through to get that job opportunity, perhaps she needed to say something about that. Perhaps she needed to say to the person who gave her that job, you know what? We might want to interview candidates for this. And I use that example because at that point, she was in a space of deep privilege, one that many of us have been in or will be in. And when we talk about what is that step from being, oh, I'm not a racist, to I'm actively being anti-racist, it is acknowledging, as Reverend Gary says, I'm benefiting from something that a person of color would not have. And then using that privilege to actually combat that. And sometimes that even means putting yourself in a space where you are now competing where before you wouldn't. Now, here's the thing. She would have got that job and she ended up getting that job anyway on her merits, right? And this is what I really think is important for white folks to understand. Black people don't want something that you don't have. We just want the same opportunities that you have. And then we can all compete together. And so I believe that it is truly a responsibility of those, because we can knock on the door all we want to. We can demand to be there all we want to. But if we're constantly even just getting the leftovers or the things that you don't want with your so-called not racist selves, right? Then we're truly always going to be a step behind you. And to me, that's really how I try to picture anti-racism. It's saying, you know what? I know I was born 50 meters ahead. I'm just going to back up and race you 1-to-1. And let's see what happens then. And I think that our faith really tells us that if we actually all do that, we're actually all going to be okay. We're actually going to be better for it. I think, frankly, that is the trick of racism, right? Racism is actually a tool of simply perpetuating a power dynamic, right? It's actually fake to perpetuate a power dynamic. And I think we want to remember that when we're reflecting and challenging ourselves to really go that extra step.
Great story, Greg. Thank you for sharing that personal piece. And it does demonstrate how, for those of us who are white, so often we don't feel that there's anything racist happening. We don't think anyone's being discriminated against. We see it in such a we have sort of a delimited historical view, but also such a limited social core. Dr. Jones was talking about this morning how research he's done, something like 90% of white Americans do not have any person of color in their social core group. So we're in a bubble. So we're so unaware of something like what your wife experienced, that we don't even ever think of it or connect it with anything that has to do with race or discrimination or prejudice or inequity. And so we just go on with it. So that's a great example. Let's close with this. Again, like I said, we've got lots of people watching, lots of people who want to do something. If we were going to make it for individuals, what's one concrete step they could take in the, next 100 days, or before we get to the commemoration, or even, the next 100 days after the commemoration? I've got a great concern that way too many people will become aware of what's gone on, and after June 1, we'll think, oh, well, we did that, and go back to things as they were, which would be very unfortunate. So just any steps that particularly white people can take to move toward being an anti-racist, to move toward greater racial justice. What would you all hold up as important steps or examples of steps people could take, like Greg shared in that story?
I'd like to start. I'd sort of like to speak to the last question and also to yours at the same time, because I smiled. I have a colleague and mentor Julia Jordan-Zachary, who told the story years and years ago about talking about, white privilege in her classroom and having a young white woman kind of push back is, well, I'm not a racist. And she said, it's not about you, boo. Right. I mean, and that's really fundamentally, the point, right? The question about racism is not one, there's an individual component to it, and that's a meaningful part of the story, right? But we are all caught up in a racialized fabric, both in the United States and outside of it, right? And so one answer to what can you meaningfully do is there's so much. So whichever one engages you the most, pick a history book, pick a podcast, watch 13th on Netflix, whatever your sort of medium that draws you in the most is, you can start there. That's one really concrete thing that you can do. And I think to your point about the social core, that's another one. Notice when you are around in all of the spaces that you inhabit, how diverse the population is. And if it's not diverse, take note of that and think about why. And think about the fact that in the end, we can study and we can become really great experts. And that's certainly one approach. But the other way in which we learn is that we engage with people and we converse with people and we hear their stories just, around the neighborhood, on the porch, walking the dog, raking the leaves. And if you don't have anybody in your life who, as part of an everyday conversation, one day you're talking about what you had for dinner, the other day you're talking about the really unfortunate interaction you had at work. And part of that is, the way in which I experience racial inequity. And you can say to yourself as you move through life over time, like, gosh, I hadn't thought about this before, but now I'm thinking about that story that my friend told me one day when we were talking about many of the things that we spoke about the way in which this, particular form of racial inequity manifested for them. And now I can see it more clearly. And I can think about how I'm now in a space where I don't want to perpetuate that, where I want to speak out against that, whatever the case may be, right? You can't really integrate that if you are not, if you're not engaging with it in a really everyday way, right? I mean, I think that's why, for a lot of years, sociologists, and they may still do this, I haven't looked at the data in a while, but for a long time, one of the fundamental questions about where are we really racially as a country was, would you be okay if your son or daughter married somebody of another race? Because that told us so much about what's your real commitment to this. And I think that we're still there and doing that work and can continue to do that work moving forward.
Excellent.
Now, in fact, we're much more concerned if our son or daughter marries a Republican or a Democrat. That's the big divide. The big divide now. Okay, so my word would be penance. When Martin Luther reduced those 7 sacraments down to 2, and most Protestants followed suit, he thought hard and long about keeping penance in there. And I think penance is a missing part of this. Of our Christian narrative, a Protestant Christian narrative, as we think about how our Protestant Christian narrative within the body of Christ applies to our nation, our civic communities in the nation. And I wonder what we'd come up with if we said, okay, what if every one of us thought about what penance when it comes to race relations would look like? For me to engage in and for the congregation which I attend to engage in. I think that would be a really interesting both discussion and perhaps set of practices that would come from that.
I would say a lot of what Doc said. So I'll be quick. Read something, talk to someone, and I'm gonna add buy something from a Black business or in support of Black institutions or Black organizations doing this work. And then ultimately get to where you can challenge something. It doesn't mean that you have to be right, but when we challenge, we force all of us to think, and that ultimately moves us closer.
Thanks. Anybody else?
I would like to end by saying and quoting Dr. King. We just celebrated a short while ago. Due to man's technological advances, we have been able to turn the world into a neighborhood. What I mean by that, you can leave Japan on Saturday and fly to California and get there Friday night. So much so people ask you, when did you leave? I left tomorrow, and so we have been effective in turning the world into a neighborhood. We now need to turn it into a brotherhood. And that brotherhood is a place where you have shared suffering and shared success. Whereas you answer the question that God asked Cain, you know, where's your brother? And he answered it wrong, saying, am I my brother's keeper? The answer should have been the affirmative. Yes, I am my brother and not my sister's keeper. And we have not done that. We have not done that. And so I think that we ought to treat racism with even more severity than we treat COVID-19. And as COVID-19 has literally shut down how we do things as a country, if we are truly serious about addressing the problems and vestiges of racism, we need to be willing to take the same amount of attention to fighting a virus that can biologically infect you, to fight a virus that can mentally, emotionally, and physically kill folks. And so that means being active. That if you are in Tulsa, that means writing a letter right now to our email to your city council person, asking them, why can't we do what the Congress has done as far as forming a commission to study how we can actually implement reparations. In fact, we have more information than the country does because we have the commission report from 2001. That means being an advocate. This is no spectator sport. You know, we need all hands on deck if we're truly to be that brotherhood or sisterhood that God intends for all of us to be.
Michelle.
Yeah, and I would echo that, the brotherhood and sisterhood. I think for me, it's so important that we take this on individually. It's one thing to be a member of this great congregation who's doing great work, but it's up to me. And I would challenge our members that you know that you learn the terms. Do you really know what implicit bias is? Do you really know what redlining was? Do you really know, I mean, what is institutional racism? How is it manifested? I mean, you can set aside whatever time during Lent would be a great time, 30 minutes a day or however much during your week, and just go down rabbit holes and read and educate yourself. But I really believe you have to show up. The Black community is not going to come to the white community. We have to go to them, and you have to be present, and you have to sit, and you have to learn, and you have to build relationships, and you have to build trust. And it's a life's work. You don't get to do it just this year in commemoration and be done with it. And besides, once you build those relationships, you want them longer than a year, right?
Right. All right. I think I'm going to give Dr. Jones, our Barton-Clinton-Gordey lecturer for this weekend, the last word before we wrap up today.
Well, thank you. I'm such an honor to be here with all of you doing this difficult, critically important work on the ground and helping. I think, Michelle, what you said, all eyes are upon us. I think about this biblical illusion, we have a great cloud of witnesses gathering around us, and I think that that's true here. This is a major, not just a local event, but a national and international event. And the work that you all are doing is helping to create blueprints for the rest of the country. There are no great blueprints, all right? We are creating them as we go here. The one quick thing I'll say about just individual things, yes, we got to build relationships across lines of difference and along racial and ethnic lines. We have to do that. That's a little harder to do perhaps in the pandemic. But in the meantime, let me say this, reading Black authors has changed my life. If you're white, you should know names like James Baldwin and Toni Morrison and Kelly Brown Douglas and Howard Thurman and Eddie Glaude and Emily Towns, somebody mentioned in the thing. These are people who should mean something to you. James Cone, right? And I think reading not just King, right, but this other cloud of witnesses, and many times what they have done is they have held up a mirror to the white church, right? And if we're just willing to look in that mirror, it's a pretty good set of steps for where we need to go. And I'll close with this and just saying, like, I have a great deal of hope just seeing this group here assembled, and the fact that this conversation is happening is a really big deal. We've got just on this call, Reverend Dr. Robert Turner, this historic African-American church that was the victim of, kind of violence and desolation. We have Reverend David Wiggs, and to think about, I think, this church as well. I talked about it this morning in the sermon. Boston Avenue, like my church, I grew up in the South as a Southern Baptist. Boston Avenue was part of the Methodist Episcopal Church South, right? That was the Confederate supporting side of the Methodist Church when it split over the Civil War. And the Sunday after the Tulsa Race Massacre, the bishop, the presiding bishop in the Methodist Episcopal Church South, took the pulpit at Boston Avenue, blamed the violence on the African-American community, and unequivocally stated that social equality between the races was never to be, because that was divinely mandated. And here we are today, 100 years later, with Reverend Wiggs and Boston Avenue doing very different work in the community, right? And I think we talk about, like, that arc. It's a 100-year arc. It is a long, long arc. But if we think about, this promise of, and it doesn't happen automatically, of the arc, bending toward justice, the arc of the universe bending toward justice, it only happens by these kinds of conversations and this kind of hard work on the ground. So I just want to applaud all of you and say how grateful I am to see this work that it's practical, it's spiritual, it's moral, it's soul feeding, and we need more of it. So thank you. Thanks to all of you.
Thanks so much, Robert. Thanks to all the panelists. We've been here 90 minutes, so I'm going to wrap it up. We are doing 100 days toward racial justice and reconciliation at Boston Avenue. So be watching our Facebook post and other social media, and our Facebook. We'll be letting you know about that. If you'd like to hear Dr. Jones' lectures, those are all being posted on YouTube and Facebook as well. And we'll be glad to help you if we can. Just call the church or contact us. We'll continue to be a part of this conversation and hopefully help Tulsa be a more racially just city in the future. So thanks to one and all. Thanks to all the participants. We will see you later. Bye-bye.